Now, President Donald Trump has said that European leaders would visit the United States by Tuesday to discuss how to resolve the Russia-Ukraine war. Trump has also said that he would speak to Russian President Vladimir Putin soon while returning from the US Open in New York City.
Well, we're going to see. I mean, we have some very interesting discussions. You know, certain European leaders are coming over to our country on Monday or Tuesday, and individually. And I think we're going to get that settled. I think we're going to get it settled. We have to. You can't lose, you know, when they're losing 5,000 to 7,000 soldiers a week for no reason, you have to get it settled.
President Trump said that he was not happy about the status of the Russia-Ukraine war following a massive Russian air assault on Ukraine. In fact, earlier Trump had indicated that he was ready to move to a second stage of sanctioning Russia. And this, despite the dissatisfaction, Trump again expressed confidence that the war would soon be settled.
I'm not happy. I'm not happy. I'm not happy about the whole situation. You know, it's interesting. It doesn't affect us because it's not our soldiers. But they're losing now. I used to tell you 5,000. They're losing 7,000 between Ukraine and Russia, 7,000 soldiers every single week. It's such a horrible waste of humanity. So, no, I am not thrilled with what's happening there, I will tell you. I think it's going to get settled.
Russia fired its biggest ever drone barrage at Ukraine early on Sunday, which killed 4 people, including an infant, while setting the government offices in Kyiv on fire. Ukraine's Air Force has said that Russia attacked with 810 drones to be precise, adding that it shot down 747 drones and 4 missiles. The drone strikes resulted in damage across north, south and east of the country, which included the cities of Zaporizhia, Kryvyi Rih and Odessa, as well as in the Sumy and Chernihiv regions as well. The Russian Defense Ministry meanwhile confirmed that the attack did happen and stated that it used high-precision weapons and drones to strike drone assembly and storage sites. President Zelensky has warned that the attack would prolong the war, going on to say that the attack was a clear sign that the Russian president was testing the world. He even called upon allies to put heavy sanctions on Russia and individuals associated with the country. The US envoy to Ukraine, Kellogg, also echoed similar sentiments after the Russian attack. He went on to say that Russia's latest strike on Kyiv did not signal that Moscow wanted to diplomatically end its war in Ukraine. Parallelly, Kyiv's European allies have also condemned the attack and pledged to stand by Ukraine politically and militarily, but concrete offers of assistance, including the possibility of troops on ground, are still being discussed. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin has expressed his apprehensions about the venue for a possible ceasefire talk with Ukraine. The Russian president said that Kyiv's demands to hold talks in a place of their choosing were excessive. Putin said that if Ukraine seeks a meeting, it must come to Russia, and that capital city of Moscow would serve as the best possible venue for the talks.
Look, the Ukrainian side wants this meeting and proposes it. I said, fine, I am ready. Come. We will certainly provide working conditions and security, 100% guaranteed. But if they tell us, we want to meet with you, but you must travel to such and such place for this meeting, such demands are excessive.
And to discuss this further as to what exactly is happening as far as the Russia-Ukraine war is concerned, we are being joined on the broadcast by Dr. Glenn Dessen. He is a defense and security expert, joining us live from Oslo. Mr. Dessen, appreciate you joining us on the broadcast. Now, President Donald Trump has categorically said that he's not happy about the status of the Russia-Ukraine war. Needless to say, there has been no significant breakthrough since the Alaska talks happened. Do you think that the Alaska meet is redundant now, given that there's been no breakthrough whatsoever as far as ceasefire talks are concerned?
No, not necessarily. I think the United States is primarily interested in improving bilateral relations with Russia. So So we do see, I think this is why Alaska was chosen as well, because US-Russian relations shouldn't be hostage only to the conflict happening in Ukraine. Now, I do think that there's not going to be any possibility for Russia and US to improve its relation unless this conflict is resolved. But again, I think we didn't have any diplomacy almost for 3.5 years. So finally, we have an American president who's talking to the Russian side. I think this is the first step in resolving the conflict. But the idea that this would be resolved in 24 hours, I think this was always silly. This is a conflict which has been building up for the past 30 years. We've been essentially allowing the pan-European security architecture to collapse. And so it's no easy solutions for this. So I do think it's going to take some time.
Yes, a point taken. That also brings us to the question whether the second round is going to happen and what is going to be the step forward here on. But quoting the statement that came in from the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who's called for secondary sanctions by the US and the European Union on Russia and countries that buy Russian oil essentially. With the EU leaders also expected to visit US in the next couple of hours, less than 48 hours if I'm not wrong. Do you think the EU and US are on the same page?
Well, to some extent, I think the Europeans, they would like mostly to pull the United States deeper into this conflict because the US is looking at trying to decoupling a bit from this proxy war and essentially leaving it to the Europeans, while the Europeans would like to bring the Americans closer in and retake leadership in this war against Russia. So they're not completely on the same page, but at the moment, I do think that what the Americans would like to see is to get some concessions out of the Europeans as well, because at the moment, both Zelensky and the Europeans haven't really been willing to make any concessions at all. And the EU is still talking about troops on the ground, which is unacceptable to the Russians. They're talking about NATO membership for Ukraine. They're talking about reparations. So they're not willing to meet any of what the demands that Russia is putting forth. And the Russian demands as well, they're quite high. Again, not only do they want Ukraine to restore its neutrality, but they also want recognition of territorial losses as a result of the war over the past 3.5 years. So both sides have very difficult and high demands. So Trump's, I guess, role is to try to bridge some of this gap, but also at the same time, while he's portraying himself as the mediator, the United States has been, I would argue, the main actor in this war over the past 11 years. So it is a very difficult position he finds himself in. And keep in mind, in the United States, within Washington, there's not that much happiness either about Trump's policies. They would like to also see going back to the Biden policies of just continuing to fight this war against Russia.
Yes, Mr. Decent, point taken. Last question before we let you go in two parts. One, how do we ensure that the teething issues between the European Union and the US get resolved so as to see a headway as far as the ceasefire talks are concerned? And second, what do you make of the India-EU FTA negotiations on one hand and US attempting to pile that pressure on European Union to impose secondary sanctions on countries that purchase the Russian oil?
Well, first, I think on the pressure that the Americans are putting on the Europeans, it's quite interesting because you can interpret it in two ways. One, because while Trump is talking about peace with the Russians, at the same time, you have his administration calling for full increasing the economic sanctions against the Russians, trying to collapse his economy. They're talking about selling more weapons to the Europeans, which they can give to the Ukrainians. So this efforts of escalating further. But this can be seen as two ways. One is that the whole efforts of doing diplomacy with the Russians is very deceptive, much like it was with Iran. They're already planning to strike, not directly, of course, but or alternatively, they're just trying to mount pressure on the Russians, so they will give some more concessions in a coming settlement. And so I think at the moment the Europeans and Americans would like to get closer to a common position so they can at least approach the Russian from a common stance. I think the problem is that if Trump gives too much to the Europeans, then he can't give anything to the Russians because it's worth noting that the Russians they're not really see that they're in a position to give many concessions, because from their perspective, they're fighting an existential battle. That is, they see NATO and Ukraine as a threat to their existence. Also, they don't have to give any concessions, because if there is no peaceful settlement, they will just achieve their objectives on the battlefield. So given that they're winning, they see that the losing side have to make the concessions. So it's a very difficult position that the Europeans and the Americans are currently in. And I'm not sure to what extent they're going to be able to find a common position, especially as the US seems to want Europe to make concessions, while the Europeans want to pull the Americans back into a more prolonged proxy war against Russia. So we're still very far apart. Now, with India, I think that it's going to be... I think the goal of the United States is to mount as much pressure as possible by attempting to, more or less dictate the foreign and trade policies of other countries, to put a blockade, for example, on Russian oil. But I think the painful experience by the Europeans is that they gradually made themselves too dependent on the United States, to the point they're now become completely subordinated. And I think this is quite obvious in the recent optics and the trade agreements. And the Indians doesn't want to end up in this situation.
Right. Point taken, and remains to be seen, of course, what essentially comes out of the meet between the European Union leaders and the US. For now, there is clearly no headway. Appreciate you joining us on the broadcast.
Thank you.